What would you do if you took a job as a prison guard, only to discover the dying inmate you're assigned to is the father who abandoned you? That is the impossible reality facing Officer Elena Rivera. He is a man dying of cancer, serving time for a crime he confessed to, but didn't commit. And he has no idea the officer watching over him is his own daughter. If you believe that the most powerful truths are the ones hidden in silence, please like this video and subscribe so these stories can be shared. Stay with us, because this is the true story of a family secret and a final chance for peace. No one expected a man like Franklin Doyle to end up behind prison walls. Once, he had a home, a white house with a porch swing and a yard full of sunflowers his wife loved. But that was before the letter arrived. The letter that changed everything. The day he opened it, he learned his own son had disappeared after a fatal accident, and the police were knocking at the door. By nightfall, Frank had confessed to a crime he didn't commit. It's a story most people in town stopped talking about years ago. But inside these gray walls, the whispers never really fade. Franklin Doyle was 56 now, a man built from years of hard labor and quiet faith. Before the orange uniform and the barbed wire, he was a welder out in West Texas oil country, a man who believed that providing for your family was the purest kind of prayer. His hands, rough and burned from the rigs, once held his son when he was just a baby, once built the swing that hung from their oak tree. He used to joke that he could fix anything. But some things, once broken, can't be welded back together. In prison, Frank didn't talk much. Other inmates called him preacher, though he wasn't one. Maybe it was the way he sat with his Bible open, whispering words no one could hear. Or maybe it was how he carved those tiny wooden birds from scraps of lunch trays, birds that couldn't fly, yet looked like they wanted to. Each day passed the same. Wake up, work, pray, carve, repeat. The world outside had forgotten his name, and he was fine with that. Until one morning, a new voice echoed through the cell block. Officer Rivera, reporting for duty. She was young, early 30s, steady in her step. Elena Rivera, new correctional officer at St. Mary's Correctional Facility. She didn't smile, didn't make small talk. Her uniform was crisp, her eyes sharp. But when she passed Frank's cell, something in her expression softened, just for a second. He looked up from his carving, their eyes met, and then she moved on. Later that evening, as the prison lights dimmed, Frank felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, after all these years, life was about to test him one last time. Inmates whispered about the new guard, how she kept to herself, how she worked overtime, how she never joined the gossip at the control room. But Frank noticed the way she paused near the chapel door, the way she watched when the chaplain passed out old hymn books. He didn't know her name yet, but for the first time in years, he felt a stirring, something small, fragile, dangerous. Hope. At night, when the others slept, Frank ran his fingers over the half-carved bird resting on his bunk. The wood was rough, uneven. A mistake in one cut could ruin the whole thing. He smiled faintly. Life was like that. You carve what you can, even in the dark. Outside, the rain began to fall over the razor wire. The sound echoed like distant applause. Soft, endless, forgiving. Frank closed his eyes and whispered the same prayer he'd whispered every night since the day he confessed. Lord, if I ever get one more chance, let it be for the truth. But he didn't know that truth was already walking down the same hallway, wearing a name tag that read Elena Rivera, and carrying a secret that could break what was left of his heart. Elena Rivera had been working at St. Mary's Correctional Facility for just 3 weeks when she first saw his name in the medical file. Franklin Doyle, 56 years old, stage 4 liver cancer, no visitors, no family listed. Just a note at the bottom, declined palliative release. Most inmates begged to leave early when death came knocking. Not him. He'd signed the refusal form without a word. That night, as rain tapped against the security glass, Elena sat alone in the control office, flipping through stacks of paperwork. Her shift was quiet. Too quiet. To stay awake, she organized old records, cross-checking medical logs with inmate IDs. Then she saw it again. Doyle, F, blood type O negative, rare. Something about that name made her pause. Doyle, It wasn't common in her family, but it wasn't unfamiliar either. Her mother had whispered it once, years ago, when she thought Elena was asleep. The memory flickered like static, her mother's voice soft and regretful. He had a good heart, but life broke him before he could love right. Elena blinked hard, shook off the thought, and turned back to the file. She was here to work, not to dig into ghosts. Still, when she saw his handwriting on the medical form, neat, careful, almost gentle, something stirred. The next morning, she passed his cell again. He was sitting by the window, carving another bird. His fingers trembled slightly, his skin pale. She noticed the tremor, the quiet patience in his movements, the way he whispered to himself. "Mr. Doyle," she said, her tone steady. "You have a medical appointment at 10. He looked up, eyes clear but tired. "Don't need it, ma'am. I'm fine where I am." No anger, no bitterness, just calm acceptance, like a man waiting for the tide to take him. That night, she couldn't sleep. She opened her phone, logged into the 23andMe app she'd used 2 years ago after her mother's birthday. It was supposed to be a gift, a chance to learn about her roots. She hadn't checked it in months. When the screen loaded, her breath caught. Close genetic relative found, Doyle F. Estimated relationship, parent. Her stomach twisted. It had to be a mistake. The name, the blood type, the state. It all matched too easily. She closed her laptop and pressed her palms against her face. For the first time in her career, the rules she lived by, boundaries, discipline, control, felt like thin paper walls. At work, she avoided his block. She told herself she was imagining things. But every time she walked by, he seemed to sense her hesitation. One afternoon, she found him in the infirmary, coughing into a towel, dark red. The nurse beside him whispered, "He's running out of time." Elena stood frozen at the door. Frank lifted his eyes, and for a moment, their gazes met again. Something heavy, unspoken, passed between them. He smiled faintly. "You ever think some people are born just to keep other folks' secrets?" She didn't answer. She turned away before the tears could rise. That night, in her small apartment, she called her mother. "Mom," she whispered, "tell me about the man you used to love." Silence. Then, her mother's voice, cracked and soft. "Some truths, Mija, won't set you free. They'll just break you all over again." Elena hung up, trembling. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Inside her chest, 2 worlds collided, the daughter she'd been and the officer she'd become. In the darkness, she whispered to herself, "He doesn't know who I am, and he never will." But even as she said it, she knew it was already too late. Elena came to work early that morning, long before sunrise. The corridors were quiet, the air cold and heavy with the smell of bleach. She walked slower than usual, her boots echoing off the walls. Every sound seemed louder, like the building itself was reminding her she didn't belong here anymore. She stopped by the infirmary window. Frank Doyle was awake, sitting up in bed, sketching something on a small piece of paper. His breathing was shallow, but steady. For a long time, she just watched him, wanting to walk in, wanting to say something, and yet doing nothing. She'd been trained for years to follow rules, to stay detached. "Don't let your heart cross the yellow line," her academy instructor used to say. But what do you do when your heart is already on the other side? That afternoon, Warden O'Connell called her into the office. The warden was calm, as always. Her gray hair tied back, her words measured like a judge's. "I've noticed you've been taking extra shifts in the infirmary," she said. "That's not typical for a new officer." Elena straightened her back. "Just covering where needed, ma'am." O'Connell's eyes lingered on her. "You've got potential, Rivera. Don't let feelings cloud your judgment. Prison isn't a place for sentiment, it's for structure." "Yes, ma'am," Elena answered, though her voice barely carried. But inside, her thoughts were loud. Too loud. Structure couldn't explain why her hands shook when she saw his handwriting. Structure couldn't quiet the ache in her chest every time she thought of the word father. Later that week, Chaplain David found her in the chapel, staring at the old wooden cross. "You look like someone trying to pray but too proud to kneel," he said gently. She half smiled. "You talk like you know me." He shrugged. "I talk like I've seen your eyes before." The kind that carry guilt that isn't theirs. She turned away. What if telling the truth ruins everything? Truth doesn't ruin, he said softly. It reveals. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She imagined walking into his room, telling him everything, that she was his daughter, that she'd found out by accident, that she'd hated him for leaving. And yet somehow, she couldn't stop caring. But each time she imagined his face, fear stopped her. What if he denied it? What if he didn't want her? At the end of her shift, she passed by his room again. He was awake, coughing softly, holding one of his carved birds in his hand. When he saw her, he nodded politely. Evening, officer. Evening, Mr. Doyle. He looked at her for a moment longer than usual. You ever lose something so long ago you start to wonder if it ever existed? She froze. What do you mean? He smiled faintly. A daughter. I had one once. Or maybe I just dreamed her up to make the nights shorter. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to stay professional. Lights out in 5 minutes. But when she walked away, tears blurred the hallway. In the staff locker room, she sat alone, trembling. The truth pressed down like a weight she couldn't carry anymore. Her badge gleamed under the fluorescent light. And for the first time, she hated the sight of it. The next day, she drafted a report. Just numbers, schedules, nothing emotional. But her mind wouldn't stop replaying his words. A daughter. Maybe I just dreamed her up. By the time her shift ended, she had made a decision. She couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not while she wore this uniform. Not while her job demanded distance. But silence, she realized, was also a kind of lie. That night, she sat in her apartment, staring at a blank sheet of paper. She picked up a pen and began to write, her hands trembling. It wasn't an official report this time. It was a letter, a confession. Dear Mr. Doyle, she began. There's something I should have told you the first day we met. Then she stopped. Her eyes filled, her chest tightened, and she tore the page in half. Across town, the church bell rang for the midnight service. Somewhere inside the prison, Frank Doyle coughed again and whispered a prayer. And in the quiet of her room, Elena whispered back, though no one could hear her. Forgive me, Dad. I'm not brave enough yet. The chaplain once said that everyone in prison carried 2 kinds of sentences, the one the court gave them and the one they gave themselves. Frank Doyle carried both. He never spoke much about the night everything changed, but in the silence of his small cell, the memory was always there. Sharp, heavy, alive. It started with a phone call from his son, Kyle. The boy was shaking, crying. There had been an accident. A man on a bicycle. Too much beer, too little light. 1 second of carelessness, 1 life gone. Frank remembered the look in his son's eyes when he got to the scene. Fear, shame, a boy still trying to be a man. And Frank did what fathers do when they think love means protection. He told Kyle to run. Then he took the blame. He signed the confession, walked into the courtroom, and never looked back. For years, he told himself it was worth it, that prison walls were a fair trade for his son's freedom. But as the years passed, silence grew heavier than any chain. Now, sitting in that infirmary bed, he looked at the cross hanging on the wall and wondered if God still listened to men who lied for love. Across the hallway, Elena stood behind the glass window, watching him. She'd read his case file the night before, vehicular manslaughter, no prior record, voluntary confession. It didn't make sense. He was too calm, too steady, too good. She thought of her own father, the man her mother never spoke about. She'd spent years imagining he was dead, cruel, or maybe just careless. But this man didn't fit any of those pictures. He looked like someone who had loved too much, not too little. The chaplain entered quietly and placed a small Bible on Frank's table. You've been holding your breath for 20 years, Frank. Maybe it's time to let it out. Frank smiled faintly. Ain't no breath left to let out, preacher. Just ghosts. The chaplain opened the book. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a letter. Frank's hands trembled as he read his own words, written years ago when the guilt first began to crush him. To the one I hurt by staying silent, wherever you are, I hope you grew up without my shadow. I hope you were loved better than I could ever love. His eyes closed. He didn't know who would ever read it. Maybe no one. but writing it made him feel human again. Later that evening, as the prison lights dimmed, Elena found herself outside the chapel. She didn't go in, but she listened through the door. Frank's voice was low, raspy, but clear. "Lord, I don't ask you to forgive me for lying. I ask you to forgive me for teaching my son that love means hiding the truth." Something inside her broke. When she got home that night, she opened her mother's old photo box. Inside was a faded picture. Her mother, young and smiling, standing beside a man in work boots and a welding jacket. His name stitched above the pocket, F. Doyle. Elena traced the letters with her finger. She finally understood. Her mother had loved a man already burdened by guilt. A man who left not because he didn't care, but because he didn't believe he deserved to stay. For the first time, Elena felt anger fade into something else. Not forgiveness yet, just understanding. The next morning, when she saw him again, she didn't call him Mr. Doyle. She said softly, "Good morning, Frank." He looked up startled, then smiled. "Morning, officer." Their eyes met. He didn't know why her voice shook when she said his name, and she didn't know why his smile felt like both a goodbye and a thank you. In that quiet moment, they both carried the same realization. That truth, no matter how late it comes, still has the power to heal what time and silence could not. Outside, the first snow began to fall. Soft, slow, like forgiveness, finding its way through the bars. The winter wind had turned sharp, cutting through the cracks in the old prison walls. Frank's condition was getting worse. He could barely stand, but he still asked for his wooden carving tools every morning. The nurse tried to stop him once. He just smiled and said, "My hands remember what my heart can't forget." Elena watched from the doorway. Each day she saw more of her father in the man before her, the stubbornness, the quiet strength, the way he faced pain like it was just another day's work. That evening, the chaplain stopped by with an envelope. "Frank," he said gently, "you might want to finish this before your time runs out." Frank chuckled, though it came out more like a cough. "Time ran out the day I lied, preacher. I'm just on the overtime shift now." When the chaplain left, Frank opened the envelope. Inside was a blank sheet of paper and a pen. He stared at it for a long time before writing the first line. "To my daughter, whoever and wherever you are." His handwriting shook, but his words were steady. "I don't know if you ever heard my name. Maybe your mother told you I wasn't worth remembering. Maybe she was right. But I want you to know this. I didn't run because I stopped loving you. I ran because I didn't think I deserved to stay." He paused, looking out the small window at the strip of sky between the bars. "If I ever see you again, even for a second, I'll tell you the truth. That I was a coward who called it love. That I chose silence when I should have fought for you." Tears blurred his eyes, but he kept writing. "You didn't get the father you deserved, but I got the daughter I never earned. And if God is kind, He'll let me see you, just once, before the lights go out." When he finished, he folded the letter and handed it to the chaplain the next morning. "Don't mail it yet," he whispered. "I've got one more carving to finish." Across the hall, Elena was reading through the daily reports when the chaplain approached her. "He wrote something," he said quietly. "Said it's for his daughter." She froze. "Does he know who she is?" "No," the chaplain said, "but I think his heart does." That night, long after her shift ended, Elena went to the chapel. The lights were dim, candles flickering on the altar. She found the letter left on the chaplain's desk. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. She didn't make it halfway through before tears soaked the page. She pressed the letter to her chest and whispered through shaking breath, "I'm right here, Dad." But she couldn't tell him. Not yet. He was too weak, and she was too afraid. So she sat down at the chaplain's desk, pulled out a piece of paper, and began to write her own letter. "Dear Mr. Doyle, I read your words today. You asked for forgiveness you already have. The daughter you wrote about, she knows you did your best. She understands now. She doesn't blame you." She stopped, her tears falling onto the ink. "If you could hear me, I'd tell you she's proud of you, that she's here and she's never stopped needing you." She folded the letter carefully, sealing it inside an envelope. On the front she wrote only 2 words, For Frank. The next morning, she gave it to the chaplain. "Please," she said softly, "read it to him, but don't tell him who it's from." That afternoon, Frank lay in bed, weak but awake, as the chaplain began to read her words aloud. The old man listened in silence, his eyes closed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. When the chaplain finished, Frank whispered, "She forgave me?" "Yes," the chaplain said. "She forgave you." Frank turned his head toward the window. Sunlight broke through the clouds and spilled across his face. He whispered, almost to himself, "Then maybe I can rest now." Outside, Elena stood by the infirmary door listening. The sound of his breathing faded slowly into quiet. She pressed her palm to the glass, tears falling freely now. Inside, on the nightstand, the letter lay beside the unfinished wooden bird, its wings half carved, waiting for one last touch. The hospital wing was quiet that night. The hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound left. Outside, snow drifted across the prison yard, soft and slow, like time itself had decided to stop. Frank's body was failing. The doctor said he had only hours, maybe less. The nurse offered morphine, but he refused. "Not yet," he whispered. "I want to stay awake a little longer." Elena stood by the doorway, clutching a file she wasn't really reading. She had asked to cover the night shift, even though she wasn't assigned to it. When the warden looked at her in silence, she'd simply said, "He shouldn't be alone." The warden nodded once. No questions asked. Now, as Elena stepped inside the dimly lit room, Frank turned his head slowly toward her. His voice was rough, but steady. "You're still here, officer?" "Yes, sir." "You waiting for me to cause trouble?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Maybe just keeping you out of it." He chuckled weakly. "You sound like someone's daughter." She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled up a chair and sat beside him. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things neither of them dared to say. She reached into her pocket and took out the folded letter she had written, the one the chaplain had read to him. "There's something I want to read to you," she said softly. He nodded, eyes half closed. "Go ahead." Her voice trembled as she began. "Dear Mr. Doyle, sometimes forgiveness isn't about letting go of the past. It's about believing that love can still exist after the damage is done." Frank's breathing slowed, each word sinking deep into him. She continued, her throat tightening. "You once said you were afraid your daughter grew up with your shadow. But maybe she grew up because of your love. Maybe she learned strength from the man who carried guilt so no one else had to." A tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Elena hesitated, her heart racing. Then she placed her hand gently over his. "If she were here," she whispered, "I think she'd tell you she forgave you a long time ago." He looked at her then, really looked. In his fading eyes, something lit up, something that felt like recognition, like peace. "You remind me of her," he said. She smiled through her tears. "Maybe that's enough." He squeezed her hand lightly, his fingers cold, but sure. "Tell her I'm sorry for not staying." "She already knows," Elena whispered. The room grew still. His breathing came slower, each one a fragile thread. "Elena," he said, barely audible. She froze. He had never said her name before. He smiled faintly. "That's a good name for a daughter." Her tears fell freely now. "Rest, Dad," she whispered. "It's okay." His eyes closed. The smallest smile remained on his lips, like he'd finally heard the words he'd been waiting for. For a long moment, the world didn't move. Then the heart monitor let out a single, steady tone. Elena didn't cry out. She just held his hand until it went still. The nurse entered quietly and covered him with a sheet. On the table beside him lay his last carving, the wooden bird, now finished, its wings smooth and open, as if ready to fly. Elena picked it up and turned it over in her hands. On the underside, carved in shaky letters, were 3 words, "For my daughter." She pressed the bird to her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Fly home, Dad." Outside, snow fell harder, covering the ground in a soft, white silence. Inside, under the hum of the lights, the weight of 20 years finally lifted. That night, Elena left the prison for the first time without looking back. She didn't need to. The truth, at last, had set them both free. It had been a year since the night Frank Doyle took his last breath. The snow that once fell outside the prison yard had melted and returned again, as if the seasons themselves were marking time for him. St. Mary's Correctional Facility was quieter now. The old medical wing had been repainted. The same small window that once framed Frank's final sunrise now faced a tree planted in his memory, a maple sapling that bent with the wind but refused to break. Elena stood beside it, her uniform gone. She had left the job months earlier, not out of shame, but because she couldn't walk those halls without hearing his voice. The chaplain approached, holding a small wooden box. "They've finished cleaning out his things," he said softly. Inside were Frank's Bible, his last letter, and the wooden bird he'd carved for her. Elena took the box in her hands. Her fingers brushed the grain of the wood, the carved wings that still felt warm somehow. "Did you ever read what he wrote before he passed?" she asked. The chaplain nodded. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked that his story remind people what it costs to love in silence. They walked together into the chapel, where a framed letter hung on the wall, a copy of Frank's final words. Above it, written in gold letters, was the line he'd once whispered to the chaplain: "Forgive not for heaven, but for peace." A few inmates sat quietly in the pews, reading the letter like scripture. One of them whispered, "He was the one who took the fall for his son, right?" Another replied, "Yeah, said love makes you do foolish things, but maybe those are the only things that matter." Elena smiled faintly. She didn't correct them. Some truths were better left carried in silence. Later that day, a man walked into the chapel, tall, nervous, holding a small chip between his fingers. Kyle Doyle. He had been sober for over a year now. He approached the altar, placed his AA coin beside the framed letter, and stood there quietly. Elena didn't move at first. She just watched him from the back, her heart steady, her eyes wet. When Kyle finally turned, their gazes met. Neither spoke. There was no need. He gave her a small nod, one that said, "Thank you," and "I'm sorry," all at once. Then he left, leaving the coin beside his father's letter. Elena stepped forward. The chip gleamed under the candlelight, engraved with the words, "One day at a time." She placed the wooden bird next to it. For a moment, the two objects, the coin and the bird, seemed to belong together. Symbols of two generations finally at peace. She stood there in the stillness, remembering his voice, his quiet laugh, his tired eyes that still held so much gentleness. In her heart, she heard him say, "You remind me of her." And now she could finally whisper back, "I am her." Outside, the maple leaves rustled in the evening wind. The sun dipped low, spilling gold light across the chapel floor. Elena turned toward the door, taking one last look at the letter on the wall. "Forgive not for heaven, but for peace." As she walked away, the chaplain's voice carried softly behind her. "He would have been proud of you." She smiled through tears. "I think he already was." The camera would have lingered there, on the letter, the bird, and the coin, each telling its own version of love, guilt, and forgiveness. And as her footsteps faded down the hall, the narrator's voice returned, low and warm. In the end, forgiveness isn't about forgetting the pain. It's about remembering with grace. Because some stories don't end when life does. They echo in the hearts that choose to forgive.